On the night of June 4th, Iranian missiles and drones hit Kuwait International Airport, a civilian aviation hub, not a military base. According to reporting from outlets including the Washington Post and CNN, the strike killed one person and wounded dozens, and caused significant structural damage to a passenger terminal and the airport's radar systems. Commercial flights were suspended. Before we go further, one note for the record. Everything here is drawn from open source reporting and official statements, reviewed for analysis. Where a claim is contested or unverified, I'll say so. What I want to do in the next few minutes is lay out the full 24-hour sequence in order. Every strike, every intercept, every statement, because the picture that emerges is different from the headline. The airport strike did not come out of nowhere. On the same overnight cycle, Iran said it targeted US bases in Kuwait and Bahrain, as well as a vessel near the Strait of Hormuz. US Central Command reported that it intercepted multiple Iranian ballistic missiles and drones, and the two missiles aimed at Kuwait fell short, while several fired at Bahrain were brought down by US and Bahraini air defences operating together. CENTCOM also stated that no US personnel were harmed in those particular intercepts, and that it had conducted what it called self-defense strikes on Qeshm Island. That sequence matters. The reporting points to a pattern that has held through much of this conflict. Iran's strikes against hardened US military targets have largely been intercepted or fallen short, while the damage that lands tends to fall on softer, civilian-adjacent infrastructure. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE all condemned the attack on Kuwait, warning it threatens regional stability. Let's talk about Qeshm Island, because it keeps appearing in serious analysis of this war, and the geography explains why. Qeshm sits right at the mouth of the Strait of Hormuz. By widely cited estimates, roughly a fifth of the world's seaborne oil passes through that strait every single day. It is one of the most important energy choke points on the planet. US forces struck Iranian military targets on Qeshm. Open source reporting points to drone, ground control infrastructure, and communications towers among the targets. The strategic logic that analysts describe is straightforward. Degrade the command and control architecture that lets Iran coordinate drone and missile operations, and you force those systems to operate with less centralized guidance, which makes them less effective and easier to intercept. In other words, hitting Qeshm is less about destroying one building and more about disrupting Iran's ability to threaten the strait and coordinate strikes in real time. So why does Iran keep missing the military targets? The answer is a layered air defense architecture deployed across the theater. It works in tiers. At the outer layer, the SM-3 Standard missile engages ballistic threats high up in the boost and mid-course phases before a warhead begins its terminal descent. Inside that, the Patriot PAC-3 system handles threats that survive using a hit-to-kill interceptor in the upper atmosphere. Then THAAD, Terminal High Altitude Area Defense, catches inbound threats during terminal re-entry. It carries no explosive warhead. It destroys the target through sheer kinetic impact. And at the innermost layer sits the Phalanx close-in weapon system, a radar-directed Gatling cannon designed to engage anything that slips through. When you stack these together, you get an intercept envelope that Iranian missiles have struggled to consistently penetrate. That is the most plausible explanation for why so much of last night's military targeting failed, and why the damage that did land fell on a civilian terminal instead. There's an economic layer running underneath the military one. The US has imposed a naval blockade on Iranian ports. President Trump has publicly framed that blockade as central leverage in the negotiations, suggesting it may be doing more than the strikes themselves. Reporting also noted that US forces used a Hellfire missile to disable a Botswana-flagged oil tanker heading toward Iran, described by officials as blockade enforcement, not escalation. This points to the strategic dilemma at the center of the conflict. Analysts widely describe a cost asymmetry. The missiles and drones Iran fires are comparatively cheap, while the interceptors used to stop them are far more expensive. By some estimates, the gap is several-fold per engagement. Their exact figures vary and should be treated as estimates, not hard numbers. The takeaway is this: even when Iran loses militarily, it can try to win economically by making the cost of sustained defense high and by pressuring global oil and insurance markets. A strike near a major airport ripples outward into flight reroutes, higher war risk insurance premiums, and oil price anxiety. Iran's leadership faces its own bind. Negotiations reportedly center on pausing uranium enrichment, phased sanctions relief, and easing the blockade against verified compliance. On paper, that's a diplomatic pathway. In practice, for Tehran, signing terms that look like capitulation carries real domestic political risk. That's the lens to read Iran's messaging through. When officials frame the war as something forced upon them, it's aimed as much at a domestic audience as an international one, projecting strength while under economic strain. This is a regime survival calculation layered on top of a military one, and the two don't always point in the same direction. Which brings us to the question this conflict keeps circling back to, and which no clean answer resolves. One path is to escalate decisively and accept ownership of whatever follows. The other is a negotiated framework, and the risk that it frays resetting the cycle. There is no costless option here, and anyone claiming otherwise is oversimplifying. I'll leave the question with you. If this kind of sequenced, sourced breakdown is useful, subscribe. The next one follows what happens if the negotiating window closes. Thanks for watching.